Mhm.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this strange and I don't know, what's the word I want to say? It feels, I saw somebody say that we're in this liminal moment, right? We're in this strange moment of anticipation. It's weird. It's really strange. And tree limbs are falling down around me. I've been without power over the weekend. It's just a very um, strange time, but I'm really glad to see all of you, including the people who are not showing their video. I'm glad to see your names at least. And for us to come together this evening to talk about a really important subject. I think one that has not probably gotten all the attention that it merits in this season of problems, catastrophes, and crises. But we're going to talk about domestic violence and how the pandemic has impacted it. So we have two great speakers I will introduce in a sec. Before I do so, please note that we are meeting again next Monday, same time, same bat channel, so to speak, to talk about vaccines and equitable access for vaccines. And Brooke Baker and John Kahn, who are here, which is great, will be speaking to us about that. We then go, what was the old, on summer break, right? And for the transition for the fall semester, quarter rather, and depending on popular demand and whether or not there is still a pandemic, we will potentially meet again in the new year. Somehow I have a feeling there's still going to be a pandemic. So again, thrilled tonight to have our two speakers or discussants, Margo Lindauer, who is Margo, I don't know, she's the director of our clinic at Northeastern University School of Law and a true expert and advocate on issues of domestic violence, and Morgan Wilson, who is our domestic violence fellow. And I'm thrilled that they're joining us. For those of you who know or have joined us in the past, these are relatively informal discussions. So we'll let our speakers speak for a while, and then hopefully we have a good conversation. We do end sharply at 7:30 because it's late enough. And by after the 12th hour of Zoom, it's probably time to take a break. But I'm thrilled. So take it away, Margo and Morgan, and thank you again for coming.
Well, thank you both so much for having us. I think when we agreed to this date, we didn't actually agree to this date. So while much of what we're going to talk about is depressing and troubling, there is a lot being done in this space, particularly at the law school. And so hopefully that can leave some of us with a little bit of hope as we enter into tomorrow and the future of the pandemic. But I know we're on a strict timeline. And so Morgan and I wanted just to quickly introduce ourselves, give you a little bit of background about where we were pre-pandemic, and then what we did and why we did what we did in March and April as a response to the pandemic. So I'm Margo. I'm the director of the clinical programs here at Northeastern. I also run the Domestic Violence Institute.
And I'm Morgan. I am a 2017 grad of Northeastern. I'm the DVI Legal Fellow, and I run the Legal Assistance to Victims program for first-year law students.
So pre-pandemic, the situation for victims of domestic violence in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was really challenging. What we see kind of consistently across the country, but in Massachusetts in particular, that there's never enough supply of services or shelter space for victims of domestic violence. So in any given day pre-pandemic, there were much more individuals seeking shelter than there was shelter available. There were many more individuals seeking legal services than there was eligible or lawyers offering free legal services. and many individuals were stuck at the intersection of multiple courts and processes and administrative agencies. So it's not infrequent to see a victim of domestic violence who's also potentially suffering from housing instability or food insecurity or challenges with a school system or transportation or benefits issues, immigration issues. There's frequently, but not always, many challenging dynamics that a victim has to maneuver when they're seeking any services to begin with.
And then the sort of pandemic hit, right? And so we experienced the shutdown, and people were stuck at home with their abusers, with extremely limited access to much needed legal services and support, among other social services support. So what this looked like was courts shut down. There was confusion about where and how to access resources and whether these resources were even available. So people would go to court looking for an order, and the doors would be locked with no sort of like notes or messaging about calling in or what numbers to call or if there was another court they should go to. There was also once the sort of like first month of the pandemic kind of came and went, courts issued standing orders about where and how to access resources and services for individuals seeking support from the court. And what happened was that messaging was inconsistent across the board, both by courts within a singular jurisdiction. So you might have a court that's a district court utilizing a standing order very differently from a probate and family court. And then you had inconsistent messaging and utilization of standing orders in different jurisdictions more broadly. So what was happening in Dorchester might be different from what was happening in Fall River. And so it was very confusing for both people seeking support and for advocates to know how to sort of help people in this pandemic moment. And then, of course, there were issues around access to the very limited information out of the courts in terms of multilingual access. So most of the messaging was in English. So in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, there are 5 primary languages to include Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean Creole, Portuguese, and English. And so for people that were non-English speakers, they were facing the extra hurdle of figuring out how to get access to information in a language which they didn't speak. There was also issues around where people could access this information. There was no information initially online. There were no hotlines that people could call to get information. And so if you were not someone who was going to the court and there was sort of a piece of paper literally posted to the door, you didn't know where you could go for services. And a lot of legal services providers also didn't have this information from courts and couldn't update their websites with the requisite information as well. What we saw was that even though numbers were skyrocketing as people were stuck at home with their abusers during the pandemic, referrals were dropping because people were not sure where and how to access services, both from the court and from legal services providers. And so this really exacerbated the depth and breadth of domestic violence because people were stuck at home for much longer without being able to have access to ready services.
So our project kind of came together very soon after the shutdown. Dan Jackson and I got together the week before Morgan actually was onboarded with the kind of idea that could there be some sort of technological intervention that could satisfy some of the gaps that we were seeing, right? We're seeing demand go down when we know that incidents are up. We see shelters de-densifying and kind of ridding themselves of their population when we know that the need for shelter beds was increasing. We see courts not, like Morgan said, offering any consistent information or availability, and particularly in any sort of multilingual process. And so we came together, and then soon thereafter, Morgan joined with the idea of trying to create a safer technological intervention to try to meet some of the needs of our clients who we knew were stuck at home or couldn't access our help through the traditional means. And so one thing that I didn't highlight, but I should have highlighted in my introduction, is that the clinic operates, well, traditionally the clinic operates 2 quarters per year. When we're in a trimester system, the clinic will operate 2 trimesters per year, but we typically operate winter and spring. Spring quarter starts typically the last, like the first day of March or the last day of February. And so what we experienced was a group of new clinic students who had just been trained when the quarantine, when the shutdown happened. And traditionally, we receive our referrals through 2 primary mechanisms. One, through a robust network of community health centers. So we have a lot of partner relationships with community health centers across the Commonwealth, but primarily in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. And the other way we get cases is literally by sitting in the clerk's office. And so what we saw on March 15th or whenever is that we couldn't go to court, obviously, and no one was going to their primary care facility because they weren't going to their doctor for primary healthcare visits. And so all of a sudden, all of our referrals dried up. But we knew that the need was there and the need was more desperate. And so the idea was, all of this need exists. We're not reaching them. How can we reach people? And how can people get in touch with us in a safe way when they can't meet us in person, either in a health center that's relatively safe or in a court, which is relatively safe? Dan and the Law Lab kind of were the technological brains behind some of the technology, though I would say Morgan was the primary driver of the content. And so we created a website that has an intake. We can put it in the chat. It's called dvilegal.org, where we crafted a very short legal intake where individuals could put whatever name they want and whatever safe way they've identified for us to communicate with them at a time and a place and in a way that they want. So if they want to text, if they want to call, if they want us to call them by a certain name, we can do any of that. So that was new. We never had a website where people could contact us directly, unless people kind of Googled the DV clinic, Googled me, found me, and emailed me, which typically didn't happen. The other thing that we created, or the idea we created, was to create an app where individuals could communicate in a safer way. And so what we've experienced over the last 6 years is a real increase in client demand for texting when we know texting isn't safe. And so we've been in this bind as legal advocates of wanting to provide the best, most client-centered advocacy for our clients in the safest way. And we know by iMessaging our clients, particularly when our clients are living with our abuser, that that is not particularly safe. So the app was this idea of creating this Vault app, which for those of you who are more technologically savvy than I am, it looks like something else. So it looks like a calculator. It's embedded in someone's phone. You need a secure password that's dual authenticated. Once you get in, you can basically text back and forth, upload documents, and fill out court forms. That partnership is with Quadrant 2, which is a company that partners actually with the ACLU on their police brutality app. It's a very, very similar application. The third part of the project was to raise money for emergency shelter. So we indicated that shelter availability declined in response to COVID and shelter demand went up. And so the third part of the project was to raise money for emergency shelter beds, mainly contracting with local hotels who would give us cheaper rates and see if we could have some impact in the homelessness issue related to domestic violence. So March 20th, we set off to raise money in response to kind of this 3-part project. We immediately got a pretty large donation from the Shaw Foundation, which is a local foundation in Boston, to fund the technology side. So we really quickly got to work on the website and the app. And then soon thereafter, kind of worked really hard on raising money for the shelter component. The other thing that I should just mention is that we've added language capacity as well. And so we have an interpreter service that now we're able to access 24 hours a day. And the website is available in 3 different languages: Spanish, Haitian Creole, and English.
In Portuguese.
In Portuguese.
So now that we've been sort of in this pandemic for 8 months, we have a little better idea of kind of what we're seeing in ways that we can further respond to some of the needs. So one of the things that we've noticed 8 months in is that courts are still failing to notice parties of court closures that arise due to confirmed COVID cases in the court. So what happens is that staff goes in for testing. If someone tests positive, they shut the court down. And they don't have a very good mechanism by which to notice parties that the court is closed, and either party should be referred to another court or should call this hotline to figure out next steps on their hearings. And so parties end up coming to court and realize, because again, a notice posted to the door, that the court is closed. And unfortunately, much of this signage is going up in English in places where there are large non-English speaking populations. And so imagine if you are a pro se litigant without an attorney going to court where there's signage, if there is signage, in English, and you have no understanding of why the doors are locked. You don't know what's going to happen with your restraining order, if you have one, if the order will be extended. You don't know what's going to happen if you don't have a restraining order and you're coming in for a 2-party hearing. And there's nowhere for people to turn because, of course, the clerk's offices are closed and no one's there to pick up the phone. I've had this happen to me with a client, and I know Margo experienced this on Friday. The other thing is that there's a lot of confusion around requesting telephonic and Zoom hearings. And so what happens is that courts are now saying the numbers are going down, all hearings will become in person. And so for people who are immunocompromised, for people that are living with someone who is immunocompromised, for people that have children and don't have access to childcare because childcare places are still closed, or they have children who are immunocompromised, there is no good mechanism by which they can request a telephonic hearing or a Zoom hearing, either because the courts have not noticed people that they have to motion the court and provided access to those paper motions so people can fill them out and complete them, or they don't have systems in place, the bridge lines, so to speak, that are sufficient to handle the capacity of requests. Some courts are now saying, all you have to do is call and just ask for it and it'll be fine. Other courts are saying, no, you have to submit this motion, but the motion's not online, so you have to call to request the motion, fill it out and turn it back. There's also no clear indication as to whether or not, in requesting a non-in-person hearing, if the court even has Zoom capacity. Some courts have said, we don't have capacity. Other courts have said, we only have capacity for this many hearings. And so once we reach that, our Zoom, has hit capacity and everything else has to be in telephone. And so it's hard for judges to do credibility assessments when they can't see the parties. It's hard for parties who have interpreters, for interpreters to know when someone is finished speaking so that they can speak. And so there's no clear indication about how people can even get Zoom hearings, let alone telephone hearings. The other thing we see is that what happens if you have a Zoom hearing and a party fails to show, and the judge may decide that we need to move the hearing because they're not sure if a party failed to show because they didn't know about the Zoom, if they failed to show because they just didn't want to come to the hearing. And so there's a lot of confusion around what happens if an order is extended for 2 weeks or extended till next business day. And that confusion is also exacerbated by the fact that different courts are handling those situations very differently. There's no sort of standard operating procedure across the board. Add this to the fact that numbers are still rising significantly. They rose at the height of the pandemic. We had a record-breaking number of intakes over the summer. We had from July 1st, when we launched the DVI Legal virtual space. I dropped that sort of link into the chat. We've had 88, or actually 89, excuse me, intakes, either from our online intake, from our community partners, from people calling and emailing us. And that's a significantly higher number than we've had in past years. And we see
And by
that
significant, I mean like 1,000 times higher than what we would normally get. And so part of it is we've created a technology that is effective, which is great, but it also shows the dire need for services.
absolutely. And so I think that what we see now is that normally there's a lull in September, August, September, October, as people are transitioning their kids back to school, and then numbers kind of pick up. They've never stopped, right? And what we expect is that with COVID numbers on the rise and flu season coming, that those numbers will be consistently high, if not higher, as some places go back into lockdown and curfew. The other thing that we've noticed is that, as Margo mentioned, a number of people have identified that housing is a significant need for people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and sexual assault, stable housing and stable shelter. And it helps for people that have access to these things to transition out of abusive relationship into stable homes. We knew that pre-pandemic, housing instability was a huge impediment to people leaving abusive relationships. And what we're seeing now is that with dedensifying in shelters, with issues around ready access to low income housing and enough low income housing, that the need has hit dire proportions. And so we have almost everybody that comes to us is looking for some sort of housing support. And unfortunately, shelters cannot meet that demand because of dedensifying protocols. And we don't expect this to go down again with COVID numbers peaking and with flu season. I think the last thing I'll say is that there have been a number of difficulties also that people are experiencing because of limited social access to social services and legal services support. So what we've noticed is that firms who help to sort of round out through their pro bono practice access to legal services, free legal services, are doing this sort of like opt out, right? So they're opting out of providing much needed legal services when courts require parties to be in person. And what they're saying is that we're working remotely. Our firm does not require us to come into the office. And so we're not taking cases where we're required to go into court because it puts us at risk of COVID. And so what happens is that vulnerable populations who are being required to go into court don't know how to sort of request a telephonic hearing. And even if one is requested and the court denies it, they're being left without any sort of legal support services from firms, right, who are saying that they're not going to take cases where they're being required to go into court. This sort of reinforces the sort of systemic and structural access to justice issues and other sort of like systemic issues that make people who are already members of vulnerable populations and experiencing trauma feel re-traumatized by the system and invisibilized by the system, right? And so, you have this sort of narrowing of legal services support by firms and also by other legal services providers who literally don't have the funding and the staff to meet the increased demand. And so one of the things that we're trying to do right now through our project is raise more money to increase our shelter program and also to sort of hire a contract attorney. We've hired one contract attorney who will be working with us very part-time and a part-time case manager to sort of help us our staffing needs in the sort of shelter program and our extended stay shelter program that we have presently, but we need more support. And so we're working to raise more money to bring on more people to meet that demand.
Great. And so I'm just going to finish up with some takeaways and suggestions for reform that we have so far, 8 months into the pandemic. I think the kind of clear ones are that our systems are fundamentally flawed and not client-centered. I think many of these talks so far have already highlighted how systems have really failed the populations that they're designated to serve. And COVID has exacerbated those underlying issues to such an extreme extent. These are issues we knew existed before, but have been laid bare with COVID. So I think kind of the courts, social service, the shelter systems, the benefit systems have all been kind of really challenged through COVID, particularly with a population that has multiple needs. And this has been very, very clear. Our legal community is not equipped to handle the need. We have relied for a long time on pro bono legal assistance for this population, and that legal assistance is temporary and not consistent. Our legal services organizations, who are incredibly committed to the issue and to many obviously discrete issues, are also not equipped to handle the need, particularly in COVID-like conditions with the staffing that they have. And what this does is that our clients, who are often marginalized and stuck between systems, as I mentioned before, maybe it's multiple court systems, maybe it's multiple administrative agencies, maybe it's many service providers giving inconsistent or contradictory information, are often left to fend for themselves in systems that, as we just mentioned, are not client-centered and are not responding to the crisis in a way that's helpful. And so we see a lot of clients falling through the cracks in very different ways, either if that's not filing orders, if that's something that would potentially make them safer, not seeking social service support, not asking for shelter, or accessing or trying to access any supports that they can find, but maybe are not appropriate for their actual legal needs. I think, like, just very quickly, Morgan and I came up with a list of suggestions for reform that are pretty obvious and should not be too challenging to achieve. One is that all courts need Zoom. It would shock many people on this call and in general that not all of the district courts in Massachusetts have Zoom capabilities. Everything should be offered and expressed and accessible in multiple languages. I showed up at court on Friday, Dorchester Court on Friday. There was an emergency court closure because of a COVID-related issue in the probation department. There was a piece of paper stuck on the door in English that said court closed 10:30. No indication of what happened to all the cases that were on for October 30th, no number to call, no, we were serving at the time a client who only speaks Vietnamese. And so we can't actually communicate directly with this client without the assistance of an interpreter. And so kind of trying to figure out kind of how to do that amidst the pandemic and a snowstorm and a court closure. And like, frankly, we were able to effectively advocate for her today in court. But if we weren't able to navigate that with her, she would never have shown back up to court, right? Because how would she have known to come to court today? How would she have known to come to court at 2 when the interpreter was available? These systems can be made more litigant friendly, but they're not. We need to be able to receive all filings by electronic filing. So the federal court system has been doing this for many years. The district court system is, in Massachusetts at least, is woefully behind in this area. We need to have fillable forms, and we need to be able to file those forms electronically. We need to have a phone tree or a hotline or some number to call where we can reach a person when courts are closed, or have some portal of information for updated court closures. Right now, the only way that that information is getting out is via Twitter. But many of our clients don't think to check on the court closure Twitter site before heading to court in the morning. And so we need a better system. For cases like the ones that Morgan and I work on that are set to expire on a given date, and the expiration has a direct correlation to a client's livelihood or safety, there needs to be clear instruction via a standing order or something in process that gives clients and their advocates some understanding of what happens to those cases if courts are closed. So for example, on Friday, when I was supposed to be in court with this client, her order was set to expire on Friday, October 30th, 2020. We were not able to get to court until November 2nd, 2020. If something had happened over the weekend and the defendant had violated the order that existed on October 29th, I don't know if it actually would have been a violation if that had happened, because there was no order extending the order because of the COVID outbreak. And so we need to have something in writing explaining what happens to civil orders, not only restraining orders. There's small claims, there's other kind of forms of civil legal issues that are handled in district court that have expiration dates, and we need to have some clear guidance about what happens during emergency closures. And of course, we need more legal services, more safe, secure, low-income, accessible housing, and more individuals working in the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, poverty, racism, and law enforcement to understand kind of the complex and duality of needs our clients often face. So that's it. That's where we are. Oh yeah, so we have someone who, Michael, thank you for posting the court closures. Literally, that's how people are supposed to find out if courts are closed.
So that's crazy. It's a good talk. And thank you so much. So why don't we open it up to discussion? Do not be shy, my friends.
Jennifer?
Hello, that was really wonderful. Thank you to you both. So important to think about these kind of on the ground considerations for what's happening and in many cases what isn't. Also apologize if my audio goes out, just let me know and I'll repeat because I've been having issues. So what you said really struck me about the courts not having access to Zoom. I know some courts still really have issues with teleconferencing. And like I have a friend who works in the appellate courts in Virginia, and she says that nobody wants to do Zoom. They all want to do teleconferencing. Even when you can file electronically, there's still a requirement to print out. So she still has to go to the office and have somebody come in just to do the mailings and stuff like that, which is a huge burden because they require both. But anyway, she says it's been very difficult to get access to translational services just every day, of course, but let alone during a pandemic. So that's been a big thing. I've talked to some other people. And it's interesting, though, to me that there wouldn't be some of these, like I understand the infrastructure might not be present, right? But the agility for courts to so kind of quickly transition to some of these modalities, I just find to be really interesting and an example of how sometimes they're like, the process that we have is the process that we have, and that's it. And so I'm wondering to what extent, right? Or I know you're speaking to the choir, but that's what we just told you. But you know, I find that really interesting, and yet they're going to try to just use Twitter for all their communications. So to what extent has the state been offering or localities been offering any support or any kind of nudging and lessons learned to say, you know, maybe what's happening in COVID could actually be continued and improved upon post-COVID, let alone be improved upon during COVID? Is there any kind of conversation about that you know of? Or?
So I'll respond kind of in two ways. I'm obviously not privy to the inner workings of the courts. And so one
Right.
is that it feels very much like very slow. to adapt, particularly when much of what the district courts do and are community resources for communities in need, right? Like in Boston, and in every district court, honestly, in Massachusetts. So Boston has a Boston municipal court system that has various courts, and then there are district courts across the Commonwealth. We have courts in every major community. People access those courts for services, for emergency services, not just domestic violence, for mental health crises, for substance use crises, right? For folks who are on probation or have small claims issues, or who have issues with their neighbors, or right. And so these community courts really do offer, I'm not saying that they're always helpful, kind of a place for individuals to go to seek assistance. They've always been they've always been a place where people go in crisis. So the fact that they have been unable to effectively respond to crisis, for those of us who've worked in the courts, is not surprising, but it's disturbing. I would say that 7 months or 8 months in, it feels intentional. It feels very much that the courts kind of are unwilling to adapt, or some courts, and some judges and some clerks are unwilling to adapt. I think,
is it that they just don't have the capacity and the resources, or is it just they're like, this is the way we do it?
Well, there's part of it is just a very old school mentality. I was on a call a couple months ago where I was suggesting in Dorchester that this was before the courts had opened, and I said the telephonic hearings are very challenging for victims. I would really encourage us to get on Zoom, so that judges can assess credibility and see body language, which is a huge component of our hearings. And the response I got was, Dorchester doesn't have wireless. But you don't need wireless to get Zoom, right? They have the internet, like they, and so there's this very slow to respond component. Then it is each district court is very much siloed. And so one chief justice could be supportive of the Zoom technology in certain hearings, and another chief justice might not. So the chief justice in Dorchester refuses to do any restraining orders via Zoom. Just it. So all of them are in person and have been since July. Sorry, Jennifer, you had a second part of your question.
No, I wasn't certain if there had been, and I know that you're not privy, but I just didn't know.
Right. So I'm on the Access to Justice Committee related to 209As, and so there's a lot of conversation around this topic, particularly related to the in-person requirement that many courts are instituting and the disproportionate impact that has on immunocompromised litigants and attorneys, but also litigants who have children. And so we're trying to do some advocacy with chief justices around that.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Good luck.
So Jared was in the chat.
Jared.
Thank you. And thank you so much for that presentation, for sharing this. Sorry, I had to step away for a couple minutes to help with bedtime, but I'm back. And this is the website you guys share is amazing. I mean, the product is really amazing. I just wanted to say specifically about the website that I think this is a really big deal. I mean, I as you guys know, I'm involved in Lind. People know I'm a lawyer. I get a fair amount of like referrals and questions. And on this issue particularly, I thought there was not great information out there that's like clearly organized and presented. And people reach out to me on Facebook Messenger or on WhatsApp, and like giving them a number that they can call between the hours of 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. is like, I never felt like that was like meeting their need. So I think this is great. So thank you for doing it. And the multiple languages, the way that's accessible. So I think it's really awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you know, one of the things I want to say was that I feel like this is really consistent in the way that we're seeing the effects of the pandemic magnified by disparities, by race and class, and the barriers that people are experiencing, language and technology. You know, definitely seeing it in education and the work that I do there, and then also in housing and like how these benefits aren't flowing to people the way they should be in the small businesses and the programs they're setting up. So I definitely see that coming across all the way. One of the things I was interested in getting your thoughts on from the clinic's perspective is at least in Lynn, a lot of the sort of the conversations about access to mental health resources is happening in connection with a broader conversation about our sort of systematic approach to mental health and criminal justice. And the conversation about what we're asking of the criminal justice system when it comes to mental health, and what we're asking the criminal justice system when it comes to these crisis moments when there are people that do need help. And I was wondering if you guys at the institute, if that was sort of what your thoughts were on that, and how this work and find the right resources for people that are in crisis fits in with the broader conversations that are happening about the criminal justice system.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I see them as all being mutually constitutive, right? So, for example, in the context of, policing, there's a question around defunding the police and sort of reallocating resources toward social services. And I think that that's a conversation that absolutely has a deep impact on the work that we do, because, for example, what we know is that when people have robust social services, they can make decisions that aren't decisions that they make in crisis or out of trauma. They're not reactive decisions, right? They are responsive to a need, and they can be made in as thoughtful of a way as possible when someone has experienced trauma and abuse. And so I think that, COVID has exacerbated pre-existing mental health issues that people are experiencing. So you have people that are stuck at home with their abusers, they can't get social services, and not just that housing has become sort of narrowly narrowed by the pandemic, but also access to like mental health and therapeutic services. Mental health providers, counselors, psychiatrists are inundated because so many people who are now realizing what it feels like to be stuck at home. I don't want to say it's like being in the shoe, right, in solitary, but that same sort of idea that you can't leave and all of the collateral consequences of being stuck in a place and being confined, right? They're reaching out for those folks that have access to healthcare for mental health support, and those folks are feeling overwhelmed. And so I think that there needs to be a discussion around making sure that we can expand these services so that people who maybe don't feel comfortable going to the police or don't feel comfortable going to the court because they are a member of a group that maybe has not so great of a rapport with those institutions, or they themselves have a reason why they don't have a great rapport with them, have other social services places that they can go to get to feel supported, right? So like these social services are the scaffolding that helps people make informed decisions to help move them out of abusive relationships. And so I feel like there's a lot of conversation that Margo and I are seeing with housing providers, with mental health services, who we've been partnering with for the 20 some years that the clinic has been in operation, and that we understand that there is a through line between all of these things. One of the conversations that Margo and I have been having is how we can work with, as part of a team, in-house social services providers, either through master students or bringing someone on board to be able to help triage and identify places where people need mental health support so that we can find supportive services sooner in the process for them, so that they have both the legal, mental health, and at least in the piece that we're able to offer, housing support, in addition to the other social services that we're able to connect someone with. And so I think that these conversations are happening. I also want to point out that I firmly believe that these conversations, and I know this to be true, are happening at the grassroots level. You have radical community groups on the ground that are doing the work, like Black Lives Matter, like these Black and Pink, that work inside of prisons. You've got so many other groups like C4RJ that are working at the intersection of reform if you believe in criminal justice reform. And sorry, that pained me to say that. And also that are working, you know, at that intersection along with mental health reform and access to social services. And so these conversations are happening, and that they've been happening at the grassroots radical level, at the cellular level. And I actually think that the legal services industry is just now catching up. We are very behind the curve on that. But I can say, at least for the DVI, that we're having those conversations.
We're having a lot of those conversations. And I think one of the things that's both exciting and troubling is that the domestic violence community, the legal service community is a separate and apart, but the domestic violence community is woefully behind in having some of these conversations. And so having conversations about restorative justice or alternatives to law enforcement or alternative forms of accountability or community safety are things that we're thinking about and talking about and trying to be part of some of those conversations while also representing people within an existing system.
Right. And I would say, and I don't want to put words in Margo's mouth, but I believe that those conversations that we're having are in large part being driven by what our clients are asking for. Some of our clients,
Totally.
they don't want to go to court. What they want is their abuser to go to batterer's intervention.
Or they want an apology.
Right? And so, and they want their abuser to get mental health help, right? They've identified these factors that they believe, you know, or they want them to get substance abuse help. And so to our mind, you can't talk about providing holistic legal services if you're not having a conversation about robust mental health and therapeutic services, if you're not having a conversation about other social services support that go hand in hand, perhaps, or sometimes supersede the request for legal support.
Wendy?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this. One of the projects I'm working with is trying to think about what states could do, if any, to get a better understanding of how their orders, how their public health orders are impacting vulnerable populations. So not necessarily thinking about only how the pandemic is impacting vulnerable populations, but really the state orders themselves. And then thinking about, you know, what states could do in terms of their orders to remedy this. So I want you to sort of think not so much about the service end, but sort of a little bit more upstream, perhaps, you know, not the reactive end, the lawyering part. One is, you know, thinking about, so a lot of the conversations I've been in end up focusing on data collection, right? And how do you collect data and uniform data about, again, the impact of state orders. So I'm thinking about, you know, your population and your client population. And I just wonder if you know anybody who's working on that or teasing it out, what you could recommend. And again, it's sort of the order, the impact, rather than all the other stuff going on. So that's a little bit hard. But then also, you know, if, you know, what could states do in terms of their orders, okay, to result in a situation so that stay-at-home orders, or whatever you call them, and I'm using that term loosely, were less likely to exacerbate, right, intimate partner violence. So for example, one conversation people have had, and you'll know, right, in the spring, almost all of the states, when they shuttered businesses, chose, rightly or wrongly, right, to keep liquor stores open, right? Lots of things were closed, liquor stores were open. You know, is that good or bad? I've read things both ways. I don't know the answer, but I just wonder if you have thoughts about, if you were advising states to think about, were they to do something again? You know, how would you design a shutdown? Again, I'm not talking now about the court response, but the shutdown, whatever you, again, and that's obviously a loose and poor term because we didn't have like true shutdowns, but you know, the varying orders that were imposed to be less exacerbative of intimate partner violence.
So I have two quick thoughts, and then I'm really eager to hear what Morgan has to say. One, I touched on in the article that Jennifer posted, so that's very sweet. And that's related to primary healthcare and community health centers staying open during the shutdown. That a lot of folks are identifying their abuse and seeking support through medical providers. And medical providers then refer to social workers or case managers on the staff, or I often get calls from doctors themselves. And so those primary healthcare visits in both a family doc setting, but also prenatal, are vitally important. We know that pregnancy and postpartum are very, very risky times for individuals who are impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault. And so also kind of understanding what the pandemic did to prenatal visits, and that many women were no longer going in person for many of those visits and only going in for their ultrasounds and then consulting with their doctors virtually. There wasn't that opportunity to disclose. The other is schools. A lot of people, children being one, but parents being another, seek service in schools. And so that is through a variety of mechanisms. Often parents kind of go to the administrative coordinator at the school, disclose domestic violence or disclose something going on at home, and then that individual will refer to a guidance counselor or a school social worker. And so those two institutions kind of writ large, closing all at once, I think had a drastic impact on individuals being connected to services. So I mean, my immediate instinct as I hear this news swirling of a kind of looming lockdown is, and well, many schools are not open, but to keep schools open as long as possible in the safest way possible, and to keep community health centers open, or at least accessible in a way where individuals can seek help, whether that's in person or virtually.
I would add to that two things. So one, I think having the state or locality or municipality leverage community-based networks. So if you have a community network that's already working within a community, maybe reaching out to them and seeing what ways they're interacting with people through a pandemic. A lot of young people today are doing, social media activism. And so they're leveraging the internet, social media, the interwebs to be able to fundraise, to be able to find ways to still have their meetings, to sort of use the internet and sort of this idea of being viral or going viral to be able to leverage to increase their community standing and also still have this activism. So I think that there is a way to activate community groups in addition to using the internet and social media to be able to get resources out, information out across a broad platform. So not just Twitter. I don't even have Twitter. I didn't even know that there was a court closings on Twitter. So I'm glad someone sent the link because this is new to me. So across different social media platforms, right? Leveraging, creating web spaces that people can go on websites, talking to community groups about how they can get information out. One of the things that the DBI is doing is creating QR codes that people can scan in grocery stores. It says literally nothing except for 1 or 2 liners about what we do if people need services. If you fall into this category, you scan the QR code and you can either be directed to our website. We're developing a manual of resources with hyperlinks that will exist in a virtual space and in hard copy for providers and people, family members and people experiencing intimate partner violence and sexual assault. They can scan those QR codes. They can download the QR codes from the internet. Once we get this up and running, it's still in the works. But the idea is leveraging this virtual space to be able to provide service. And that's something that we across the board did very poorly. And so I think that that's one way that people can do that for any pandemic situation. I think the other thing is creating within internal organizations response mechanisms to crises. So kind of like we have FEMA, everyone has their hotline that you know what you're doing when this crisis hits this person, this person, this person. And then you kind of build from there, but you already have a foundation to work from. And I think a lot of places did not have that in place. And so they were scrambling to figure out the way to do this. I also think that we have to have some sort of signaling, right? And so you might have people that are utilizing virtual learning, right? And they're meeting with their kids' teachers online, and maybe they have a hand signal or something that a teacher is trained to know that when someone identifies this hand signal, I don't, whatever it would be, that you know that they're alerting you to some sort of issue. Whether that be this hand signals for DV or whether that be this hand signals for sexual assault or whatever the case may be. And so I think that there are ways to leverage these sort of virtual spaces to be able to expand the ability for people to identify a service need and to reach out for services.
Thank you so much. It was really great. We are actually out of time. I suspect others had questions, so maybe they can reach out to you folks.
Yes, absolutely. Morgan and I will put our emails in the chat, but if anyone has any thoughts or feedback about our website or ideas for outreach or fundraising, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you again. I hope everybody will join me with a virtual.
Thank you, everyone.
This was really interesting, and keep up the good work. You guys are doing amazing work. And I hope everybody will join us next Monday to hear about vaccines. So, and stay strong, folks, over the next couple days. So thank you so much.